This is A Story of Sorts, the podcast mostly about bookish stuff. Hello everyone, Kanina here. On today's episode, I talk with journalist Libby Copeland about her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Uncovering Secrets, Reuniting Relatives, and Upending Who We Are. Have a listen. Libby, welcome to A Story of Sorts.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So, I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I spent the first half of my career at the Washington Post. And I was a feature reporter there, which basically means, you're writing about people, right? You're getting kind of intimate with them and trying to understand their lives, trying to understand sort of culture and politics and arts and, kind of what makes people tick. And then the second half of my career, I left the Post and went freelance. And so I write for a variety of different places, magazines, newspapers. But what interests me is, this question of like identity and motivation and morality, right? How we kind of construct our lives. That's totally fascinating to me. And I find myself writing about that over and over again.
Your first book, The Lost Family, came out last year. Can you reveal a bit about it?
Sure, yeah. So this kind of grew out of that same interest, right? In kind of what makes us who we are. A few years ago, 4 years ago, I was in conversation with one of my editors at the Washington Post. I still write for the newspaper. And we were talking about DNA testing, home DNA testing, right? So the kind of DNA testing you turn to if you're really interested in learning more about your genealogy and your family history. And particularly in the States, it's an incredibly popular pastime to spit into a vial, send it in, it's $100 or less, and then you find out something about where you came from and who your genetic relatives are. And what we were hearing at the time, kind of bubbling up, were a lot of stories of people who were finding things they never even thought were on the horizon of possibility, right? They were finding out, for instance, that their own genetic origins weren't what they thought. They were finding out their families weren't what they thought. They were finding out that their understanding of their ethnic identities was completely reconfigured by this because they thought they came from a particular sort of genetic ancestry, and it turned out it was something radically different for a variety of reasons. So this idea that you could sort of launch into something as a form of entertainment and then, in fact, get these incredibly profound consequences that change how you think about yourself and disorient you, right? And change how you relate to your family. I thought that was a really fascinating example of technology's unintended consequences. And technology is another interest of mine, right? So, I decided to write about that for the Washington Post. And I wrote this one really compelling story and it kind of went viral. And then what happened is I got this flood of people emailing me saying, I've taken a DNA test. I took a DNA test 3 months ago, or I took a DNA test 3 years ago. It's had an incredibly huge effect on my life. It's changed how I think about myself. I want to tell you about it. And I had all these people telling me their stories, and I started to get on the phone with them, and I started to think, gosh, this is a book, right? Because this is not just like a few people. This is like a huge kind of cultural change, a seismic change that's happening individual by individual, family by family, that's sort of forcing a moment of reckoning with history, right? I just thought it was absolutely amazing. And I wanted to trace some of those stories and kind of mark this moment and look at it both in small terms and also in terms of its bigger significance.
What do you think compels people to get a DNA test?
What do I think of their decision to get a DNA test?
Or why do you think people get it?
Oh, got it. Right. DNA testing is really big in the US. And there's a reason why it's so big here. And a lot of that has to do with this idea of a lot of us being descended from people who immigrated here, right? And those people may have immigrated 50 years ago, or they may have immigrated 200 years ago. And in a lot of instances, they were, they gradually assimilated or maybe quickly assimilated their way out of their ties to wherever they were coming from. And a lot of modern day Americans and people elsewhere in the world kind of now are looking up and are curious, right? They might have a very specific question because they might be genealogists. And so they might be like, gosh, I've always been trying to figure out the identity of my great-great-grandfather and where he came from. Let me see if DNA testing can help me break through what genealogists call a brick wall, where they can't follow the paper records anymore. And so they're like, let me see if DNA can help. And very often it can help a great deal. They might be asking a very specific question that's more immediate. So there are a lot of people who maybe they don't know the identity of their genetic father for whatever reason, and they want to know, right? Or there's a story in the family about a first cousin, and they're trying to see if they can identify and locate that first cousin and reach out, right? And maybe like solve, kind of, fix some old family breaches by connecting the family after some generations of estrangement. And then there's just this kind of curiosity, right? There's this kind of like, who am I kind of thing that a lot of Americans are doing right now. And part of that is connected to these TV shows like Finding Your Roots and Who Do You Think You Are that are pretty big here. Part of it is just the advertising for DNA testing. Part of it is like genealogy in general, like doing all that research is like a pretty big thing right now in the States. And there's a lot of records that you can now get online that you even 10 years ago wouldn't have been able to get. So it's like all these forces kind of coming together. And there's also a kind of a narrative, I think, in the US and elsewhere of this kind of idea that if you understand your past better, you're going to better understand your present. And so there's this sort of seeking of authenticity is understood through the past.
Did you find a lot of concerns regarding privacy from people getting tested? Is that putting people off from getting a DNA test, or is curiosity stronger than privacy concerns?
Yeah, so I think historically curiosity has been a pretty major force. I think there's maybe a slightly more sophisticated conversation happening in the last few years about privacy. And part of that probably has to do with the Golden State Killer case, which was a prominent case out in California where for the first time, police and law enforcement used DNA gathered for genealogy purposes that was in, public or quasi-public databases to solve a crime and arrest someone. And that was the first time that happened back in 2018. And it was the first time that people kind of looked up and said, oh, that's possible. If you were in this field for a while, you kind of knew that it was possible. And these techniques had been used for a long time to help people who didn't know the identity of their parents find the identity of their parents. Because part of the power of the DNA databases is that you can actually identify someone who's never taken a DNA test through these databases by basically triangulating your knowledge about your family based on existing cousins that you do find. So through a third or second cousin that somebody who has taken a test, you can actually identify somebody like your genetic father who's not in the database, right? And that idea was what they used to solve this crime. And then they started solving a lot of crimes that way. And so a lot of the privacy concerns that have emerged from this sudden understanding in the US that, oh my gosh, right? It's first of all, people who never took a DNA test are kind of affected by this technology. And second of all, we don't know exactly what uses it's being put towards. We can't necessarily even anticipate the future uses. And that has become, more of a broad conversation than it was before.
There's one sentence in the book that I really loved, and it goes back to that, which is, seekers are stalkers of the living and the dead. Do you agree that while a lot of the American population is actively looking for the ancestry, many of the people are sort of dragged into it by the seekers?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it, right? I mean, there's a tension sometimes between my needs and your needs, my interests and your interests, and indeed perhaps between the interests of the living and the dead. And we don't know, right? We don't know how the dead would feel. I mean, genealogy is a long-standing thing that people have been doing for many, many generations, right? So there was always the possibility that by looking through the paper trail, you could discover something surprising, a kind of anomaly, right? Like, oh, actually, so-and-so was my great-great-grandfather's stepfather and not his genetic father. Gosh, I didn't know that. I wonder what family secret they were very understandably trying to protect by, claiming this man was the genetic father of this
Mm-hmm.
ancestor of mine, right? So that's always been the case. But DNA makes that so much more possible. And it
Yeah.
happens on a scale, right? Because there's tens of millions of people who've taken these tests now. And people don't set out, they're kind of not putting in the work to make these discoveries. They take a test and all of a sudden they're like, wait, half of my relatives are unexpected people. And then they start digging, or they say, oh gosh, my ethnicity estimate says I'm half Greek, but I didn't know I had any Greek ancestry at all. And then they start digging, right? And it's the kind of prevalence of that experience where all of a sudden you get a surprise and you start asking questions. There's oftentimes this kind of tension between, like, say, my rights to know my own genetic origins and, say, the
Mm-hmm.
identity of a parent, right? And maybe his right to not be known, or his desire to not be known, I should say, right? And his right to not have a relationship with me. And that is playing out over and over. Or it could be a tension between my desire to know who I am and my mother's right to maintain her privacy. People are put into very difficult positions because of historical circumstances, because of historical taboos, because of the decision to keep those secrets. And it's all kind of being exploded right now. So it's a difficult and often very awkward moment for families.
How many people have you interviewed for this book? And I mean specifically people telling you that those stories about DNA, and not so much people you then interviewed for research.
I've corresponded with or interviewed hundreds of people.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happened is I wrote that Washington Post story, and then I got over 400 emails from people saying, let me tell you my story, right?
Yeah.
And then from there, I started to email with some of them and follow up and actually get on the phone with some of them. So in terms of like in-depth interviewing, right, that's certainly a smaller field. And then from there kind of set out and started finding more people, right? Because I was looking for specific kinds of stories. So I
Mm-hmm.
started getting on the phone with genetic genealogists and saying, and search angels, which are people who live in this world, and saying, like, tell me some stories. I want to find some people. And in the end, the book is basically a central narrative, and then it's a lot of other stories. I'm not sure exactly how many, but maybe 10 more stories are told in depth. But
Mm-hmm.
there were many, many more that I had, and I had to kind of go, okay, this book could be 600 pages, but then no
Yeah.
one will read it. So I had to cut a lot of stories from it.
And is there any story that stayed with you for some particular reason that ended up not being featured in the book?
Yeah, there is. There's an incredible story that I wound up not being able to tell about a woman who was raised by her grandparents and told that her grandparents were her parents. And it was complicated by the fact that she was biracial, and they claimed that she was not. They claimed that she was Native American, and that went back long in their family history, and that I think because of recessive genes or something, it had, this kind of native look had shown up in her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a whole fantasy world that they had constructed where they would, claim that she was from a particular, indigenous group, native, indigenous American group. And they kind of supported that with building a teepee and things like that. It was kind of absurd. She grew up and she came to understand that, in fact, her quote unquote parents were actually her grandparents. And by the way, they were just like a white couple from Massachusetts, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had no native ancestry. And in fact, she had no native ancestry. The woman that she thought of as her aunt was her mother, and her
Oh,
father was
yeah.
Black. And, the whole thing she told me was like cognitive dissonance, because she had grown up with a lie that they were still maintaining, and she couldn't even talk to them about it, but she had
Yeah.
confirmed her own identity through DNA testing and genealogical research.
Any particular reason why it didn't make it to the book?
So I had a number of stories about people who their genetic ancestry wasn't what they thought, right? And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, I had a number of stories of people who were Black, or had significant sub-Saharan African ancestry, and had been told that they did not, basically for a variety of reasons, either because their family was racist or because their family was trying to protect them from racism. And this was one of a number of them. And as much as I loved this story, I wound up having to just go with another story that I had, which I think is equally compelling,
Mm-hmm.
but it just kind of has a different outline to it.
Have you had your DNA tested?
Yeah, I've had it tested in 3 different companies, so I'm in 3 different databases.
Found anything that you were not expecting?
You know, for me, like, we didn't have, like, the surprise, right? The surprise, kind of profound surprise that some families get. And I should say that most people who do DNA testing don't, right? That's just kind
Yeah.
of a subset. I think what we had is more the pervasive experience of realizing that the past isn't over, right? It's kind of like able to yield these incredible revelations about how we're formed based on, the opportunity to learn so much, right? So we found relatives on both my mom's side and my dad's side of branches of the tree, like fairly close relatives, second cousins to both my parents, that we didn't know existed. We didn't know these branches existed. We didn't know they survived. We didn't even know to look for them. So we would not have done the genealogical research to find them, right? If it were not for
Mhm.
DNA testing, we would not have found these cousins and made these connections and been able, in one case, to actually go to that country. In this case, this was a Swedish relative on my father's side, and actually visit them and meet them, which was absolutely remarkable. So I think my kind of takeaway from that was, whether you're getting like a profound and immediate surprise in your own nuclear family or something more distant, right, is this idea that we are shaped by the past in really remarkable ways, and we don't kind of sometimes realize how much we're being shaped by the past. DNA testing kind of brings home how the accidents and the whims of history and the small decisions and the big decisions that our ancestors made kind of came down to us, and it is forming us even when we don't quite realize it.
What is the situation in regard to DNA testing since the book publication?
There's just more people doing it. So, when I started working on the book, which was in 2017, there were 8 million DNA tests that had been sold across the 4 major companies. And then by the time the book came out, there were 30 million, and now there are close to 40.
Yeah.
So, it's quite it's quite a phenomenon. And it's
Yeah.
also, becoming more of an international phenomenon. If you just look at how the tests are being sold, they're not just in the States now, they're also abroad in other countries.
I'd like to talk a bit about your writing career as well. You write about culture, crime, and politics, or you used to. At least that's how I got it from the bio. Do you have a favorite thing to write about? Favorite medium?
Yeah, I would say my favorite thing to write is about, ordinary people, right? I mean, and by ordinary people, I mean people who are not famous, people who don't have gatekeepers, like when you're interviewing celebrities or politicians, there's always this level of permission and, having to go through people and having a limited amount of time. And that's fine. And if you can get deeper on the politician and illuminate their life, that's great. And there are people who are really good at that. But what I'm drawn to is sort of finding the story in a place where people don't necessarily know it yet, right? And I think we all have stories. I think we're all
Mhm.
worthy of being written about, right? And it's a question of finding that and then being able to stay with that person and achieve a level of intimacy where I can kind of really understand them and then explain them in writing. I just think there are like 1,000 stories out there, and I just love finding them and telling them.
I've read one article where you cover a home funeral, and a big part of the lost family is made up of personal stories. What is it like to deal so intimately with strangers?
It's such a it's such a privilege. It's so amazing. I just think it's an amazing thing to be a journalist because, and maybe you feel this way too. You get to ask people questions
Hmm.
that you would never otherwise ask them, right? And
Yeah.
they want to answer sometimes, right? And that's remarkable. I'm like someone who's very, very curious, but normally I would not ask such personal questions, right? Or I wouldn't say like, what makes you tick? Because you don't do that
Yeah.
in normal life. That's like a weird thing to do.
Mhm.
But, as a journalist, you get to be completely weird in your job, right? And so you get to be like, do you mind if I spend an hour with you on this day asking you all these incredibly intricate questions about the work you do? I'm so interested, right? And
Mhm.
then looking for, the moments, the scenes, the ticks, the mannerisms, the quality of a person's expressions that makes them very, very specific and very, very real, and then figuring out how to translate that onto the page. And you only achieve that if you spend a lot of time with someone, right? You can't achieve that in just an hour. An hour is the beginning. You have to meet them, you have to spend time with them, you have to go get a bagel and coffee with them, right? You have to wait. And then, there's these moments that emerge when you've been with them for 4 hours and it's very late, or, when you're with them first thing in the morning. And that's the kind of reporting I like to do. I find that so incredible. For that home funeral story, I spent 3 days with them, and I was there early in the morning and I was there late at night, and it was absolutely an honor to be able to write that story.
How do you choose which stories to tell from the requests you get? Is there any indicator to know that a story is going to be a good story?
At this point, I have like a pretty good sense when I read it, but sometimes what can help me understand whether a story is good is I read the story, like say someone emails me their account, and then I tell it to a friend. So I retell it. So there's a synthesis that happens in my brain, and then a further synthesis that happens when I'm like repeating the story, right? So the oral retelling, I find that we have a natural organizing principle, a natural storytelling principle when we are telling a story out loud. It's often easier to organize a story in your brain to tell it out loud than it is to sit there and type it. And that's why when you're writing and you are, seeing like the blank page, there's this kind of terror of where do I begin? But there's not that terror when you're telling a story to a friend, if you've noticed, right? It just kind of comes. You start with the most amazing thing. Then you go on to the most amazing thing. Then you take them on a journey. By the end, they're saying, holy cow.
Yeah.
I literally just had this experience on Friday night with a friend. And as I was telling her the story, she turned to me and she was like, Libby, you have to write this story. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. I didn't quite realize that I really need to write this story. So that's kind of for me, like how I vet something.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does make sense, because if someone else is also interested, then you also see how they experience a story that maybe you are interested or maybe you're not sure about it.
You can measure it against their response.
Yeah.
You can also tell when you're telling the story which parts are good and which parts you're like losing them or they're bored or they don't understand it. And then you can adjust and figure out, how am I going to shape this narrative?
Really nice. You have also edited for NY Mag a very cool series of articles called Lies We've Told. Tell us a bit about it, what the series is about and how the idea to create them came about.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I edited that series for New York Magazine, I think it was about 10 years ago. And I think they were looking for, someone to do some editing. And I came up with that idea. And I think it grew out of my interest in, the intimate truths, right? We've all kind of told these lies. Sometimes they're white lies. They're lies that help us get along. They're lies that help us make peace with ourselves. And they're so commonplace and they're so pervasive that you can't really look at someone and say, and judge them for it, right? Because we all do it. And so I was interested in writing like a series of essays that would expose this commonality that everyone else could relate to. And I started with that concept, and then I started looking out and trying to commission writers who wanted to write about lies, confess basically about lies that they had told, and the why, right? The why is so interesting. Why do we tell these lies?
Do you have any personal lie you've told that you'd like to tell us?
I'm trying to think about that. I saw that as a question, and I've been racking my brain to figure out if there's a particular lie that I have told that I could bring to mind. And I couldn't think of a good one. I'm sorry. But if I think of one, I will come back to it.
It's okay. It's no problem. I just thought it would be fun, because I saw a few on those on the series that I thought, yeah, these are in some way, some of them are quite innocent. But yeah, we all kind of do that as well, just not to hurt someone or...
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Is that a feature that you've written that you are particularly proud of, or that holds a special place in your heart?
The feature story on the home funeral, there was a couple of pieces I've written about death, right? And doing death differently. And I know that's a topic that not everyone wants to talk about. It might not be the sexiest topic, right? It's kind of a downer. But I've written a bunch about it, and I wrote about the phenomenon of people doing home funerals for the New Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started doing some book reviews, writing about the concept of the good death, right? How we do death in the US and how we're sort of so separate from it and we're sort of in a state of denial, and this movement towards wanting to reclaim our relationship to the dead and to care for the dead ourselves rather than having it kind of farmed out to the professionals, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then out of that kind of interest and that, the fact that I was writing about that field, I got this phone call from this guy down in North Carolina, and he was planning his wife's home funeral. She was dying. She had a kind of cancer that they knew she wasn't going to recover from. So it was kind of like, they knew this was going to happen. They just didn't know when. And he had felt really, really strongly that he wanted to do this thing where he was going to have her die at home. And then he was going to care for the body. He was going to wash the body. And he was going to put the body out over ice. He was going to have people come into the home and visit with her and say goodbye for a few days, right? And I think that's the article that you were referencing earlier. And he called me and he said, I want to do this and I want you to write about it. And I was just like, wow, wow. So what you're saying is that you want me to be able to fly on a moment's notice to North Carolina, right? I thought this is logistically really challenging, but I've never wanted to do something so much, right? Like what an opportunity to be intimate, to use that word again, with a family at the scariest moment. And I didn't know how long I had. And it was hell to try and place the story because, I don't know, it was the timing was unpredictable, right? The shape it would take was unpredictable. It had never been written before. I couldn't sort of guarantee how it would go. And he thought she was going to pass within 6 weeks. And so I thought, oh my gosh, so I was scrambling. And she wound up living for 9 months. And it was such a gift because I got to know her and I got to talk to her a lot on the phone and understand how she saw her own mortality and what she imagined would happen to her afterwards and how she'd made peace with the fact that she was leaving. And the story became about that. And then they called me and I was able to fly down when she died and spend that time with the family as they were going through this process, which was so incredibly painful, but also in many ways good because they were able to make it theirs. They were able to own it. They were able to bring their own order and beauty to something that is often out of a family's hands. And I will never forget being able to do that story. It totally changed the way I think about mortality and the way I think about how I want to go out. So yeah, I would say that story that ran actually when I started working on the book right at that same time.
Curious how again I was asking about how it was to be so close to strangers and how, and now you're just kind of saying that it kind of changed your point of view on death and on funeral as well, even though you didn't know them before the feature.
It does. I mean I think every time that I spend a lot of hours with somebody, it changes me, right? And that's not why I'm doing it. It's not about me at all. But I spend time with people and I see, this is how they live their lives and this is how they see the world. And it makes an incredible mark on how I see the world. Either it means I don't want to do it that way. Mm-hmm. Gosh, I'm glad I'm not seeing the world that way. They have a really negative outlook or whatever, right? Or I don't dig their politics or whatever. But usually it's not that way. Usually I kind of come to admire them or fall in love with their quirks or something, right? And that means that then they've changed me in a way that then I think of them and I think of like, wow, how would they see this? Or how would they view this? Or how would they tackle this? I just think it's an incredible privilege to get to be a journalist.
Kind of seems like it to me. I really like talking to people, so.
Yeah, exactly.
What are you working on at the moment?
That is a good question. So I have a story magazine story that's coming out hopefully in the fall, and I can't talk too much about it because it hasn't run yet. But it's got some of the same elements of the DNA testing book. So it's got some elements having to do with crime and with like basically uncovering the truth and investigations, and which is a sort of part of the Lost Family, because I talk about investigative genetic genealogy and the solving of crimes through genealogy databases. So there's some overlap there. So that piece has been a long time in the making, and it's finally hopefully going to run, and I'm very excited about that. And then I'm starting to figure out, I'm trying to think about how I'm going to make the other. I remember I was telling you on Friday night, I was with a friend and I was telling her this story, and she was like, oh my God, you have to write that. So now I'm starting to think about how I'm going to write that story.
So where can people find you online so they can know where to find those stories as well?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's libbycopeland.com. I put a lot of stuff up there, but I haven't been as diligent about updating it with recent stories. What I wind up doing is I have a newsletter that you can sign up for on the website, and I write a lot about DNA, genealogy, the search for family, the search for identity. And so I put, I send out this newsletter maybe once a month, and I put those stories in there. So, for instance, in June, I had a Father's Day op-ed, right? And that's the sort of thing that would go in it. Or back in March, I had an op-ed in the New York Times about DNA testing and race and how we're grappling with it as a country. And so that went out in a newsletter. So that's the sort of stuff that that winds up making it in there.
Great. So don't forget to subscribe for the newsletter. Yeah. I'll put the link anyway in the show's notes, so it's easier to find the website. This is the question that I always ask at the end from each guest. And it's an all-time favorite book and the book you would recommend right now.
Yeah, so there's a couple of books that I was thinking about. So one is a book that one is nonfiction and one is fiction. So one is a book that I read years ago and then maybe 15 years ago, and then had the experience of almost completely forgetting, and now I'm reading it again. Oh. I don't know if I'm the only one to whom this happens, but I read an entire book and then I'm like, did I read this book or not? And then, I read it again. And that is At Home by Bill Bryson. And it's nonfiction. It's about the history of the house. It's really, really thick. And it's so good. And I'm reading it again. And it's like just it's like a big fat juicy peach. Like, it's just like, it's so good. The juice is running down my chin. Like, he just has this way of describing historical occurrences and like trends in culture and the absurdity of history. It's so delicious that you don't feel the burden of, oh gosh, this is a really thick historical nonfiction tome, right? And to me, the best kinds of nonfiction make you forget that you're reading nonfiction, right? Ideally, you feel like you're reading fiction, which was kind of like my model for writing The Lost Family, was this idea, that I wanted it to read like fiction. And so that's something that I'm reading right now. And then I would say, like, as kind of a model, I would say an all-time recommendation is the work of Tana, who's an Irish-American suspense writer, novelist, and she's written many books. And one of my very favorites is In the Woods, which is, I think, her first book. And her work is, I admire it so much because on the one hand, it is suspense, right? So the pacing is really compelling, right? You pick up that book, you are not going to put it down, right? You're going to have to, someone's going to have to tear it out of your hands, right? But it's also psychological study, and it's also this incredible evocative description of the landscape of Ireland, and you see that throughout her books, where the natural landscape of Ireland actually becomes a character. Houses have a kind of animate quality and personality. So things that are, by some writers perhaps ignored, become like living, breathing entities in her work. And I love that. So there's this real literary quality. There's this gorgeous psychological study along with, your classic can't put it down whodunit. That to me is so amazing because she's elevating, the whodunit. And I just absolutely love her work.
It's curious because a lot of people who read thrillers sometimes kind of say, oh yeah, I like thrillers, as if it's almost excusing themselves. But I think sometimes when well executed, thrillers can be so compelling.
Absolutely. And I think that, being able to fit a story together and understand the elements of narrative, that is a remarkable gift or talent or, thing that you work your way towards. I don't know how people achieve it, right? If it's innate or what, but no, I think storytelling is an art, and I think being able to tell a story well in a way that someone can't put down, I don't think that that's something to sneeze at, right? I think that that's actually like human storytelling at its best. So I think that that's a high quality, right? That's something that I aspire to.
Highly agree.
Yeah.
Libby, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a pleasure.
It was great talking to you.
Thank you.
You can access today's show's notes via my pod page, which you can find along with all of my social media links at linktree/Karine Pereira. In there, you'll also find a link to a Story of Sorts playlist available on Libra FM, containing the audiobooks recommended by our guests, which will be updated as the show progresses. If you'd like to give Libra FM a try, you can use the code A Story of Sorts at checkout to get 2 books for the price of 1. This offer is valid for new Libra FM members in the US and Canada. Libra FM is an audiobook platform which allows you to buy audiobooks directly from an indie bookstore. Check them out. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting A Story of Sorts on Patreon. Patreon is a platform which allows you to contribute monthly to the podcast in exchange for extra content, such as early access to episodes, a shout-out at the end of an episode and on Instagram, and choosing a theme for me to talk about on the podcast. You can become a patron at patreon.com/A Story of Sorts. I'd also be very grateful if you would simply leave a review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. As usual, I'll be back in 2 weeks with a new interview. I'll talk to you then, and thank you for listening.